The weather continued to shift between cloudy and sunny, but barely a shower came down during the following week. Dew continued to do its work exactly as he was told to do, even though part of his routines were unnecessary. Alba promised to lay low. He barely saw the now 16-year-old girl, but whenever it did happen, she seemed at ease. Around 3 guards always surrounded her when she was out. Sometimes a maid came with them as well, to have a healthy walk by the coast. Her calls were still horrific, but it got better by the day. Sometimes even she herself went to greet Dew by the door. Even when she didn't say a word, her smile made him feel welcomed and almost made him forget that he had been the one who had broken her arm. It was an accident, but still. She was an important figure, a little fragile, a little spoiled, so everyone would have to treat her with care. That was not his strong suit. Working as a maid, he would probably have one expensive vase after the other break, just by dusting off a shelf. Maybe that was the reason Frederick never let him into the zone where all of the fine plates and tea time dishes were stored. One wrong move could cause a total disaster. Edith didn't know of this, yet she mistrusted him too much to let him do important tasks. It was for the best. How to spend his free time became a bigger problem than he had thought. At first he had imagined himself to be more energetic at the idea of exploring the surroundings day by day, which ended up not being the case. His second plan had been to pass it with Avery. Often he went to her door and knocked. The 4 days after their visit to the town, the two of them would meet. Then Sue mostly opened. If not her, it was no one. He knew that she was still there in the manor whenever he passed her on his usual routes, but they never had time to exchange a word since he wasn't welcome to stay on the left side. Weirdly enough to him, Avery didn't seem fazed by the lack of contact. Usually after she returned back to the castle after a long mission to either survey or fight in the critical areas, she would be less energetic, maybe even a little depressed, even if it were only a few days. Her appearance made her look exhausted, but not in a melancholic way. Whatever she was doing during her free time, it must be satisfying. The people Dew hung out with instead were, to his annoyance, Tammy and her mother. Dew did try to escape the little girl, but whenever she caught him, he couldn't just tell her to leave him alone. She dragged him off to play little games like throwing a rock as close to an object on the ground, and whoever got closest won. It was fun, he wasn't going to lie about that, but he missed having someone to have a productive conversation with. The mother watched her daughter play with the stranger from time to time. She wasn't very talkative, though. Quickly he learned that Tammy was the only one of their small family speaking fluently. The older daughter did okay, but rather kept her thoughts to herself. The mother was a nightmare. There was no structure, she switched out words a lot and her accent was thick. Surely she would be seen as a competent woman, but the language barrier was as high as the city walls, so whenever she spoke to Dew, he would end up nodding, even if he didn't understand a word of what she was saying. As the last 4 days approached, he began encouraging himself to keep going. His final countdown started. Then he would have time to talk to Avery during the walk back home. Then the usual people would be waiting for him. He especially looked forward to seeing Josephine again and her husband. Maybe he could finally expand his social skills after this. The idea of seeing Tiana again on a regular basis was the only thing horrifying him, but what was she supposed to do? Dew swore he wouldn't be taking her insults and self-praise anymore. What he probably missed the most was his own private room. No noises from everywhere, no strangers, no snoring. Just him and his partner from time to time, and he wouldn't feel anxious leaving his things laying on display anymore. It was concerning to come back to the 2-bedroom and find his belongings in a different spot than he had left them in, even if it was never anything personal. It was the second evening before they would leave the manor. Edith was screaming, Tammy was crying, and the mother yelled at Edith to stop screaming. A cauldron laid on the ground, its content was running through the cracks of the stone like a miniature river. Dew was kneeling down, scrubbing away the mess, while the other two were too busy trying to improvise a new dish after Tammy had burned her hands on the metal and dropped the soup. He wanted to bury himself in the water bucket next to him, but it was dirty and someone had to clean up before it permanently stained and would begin to smell. It was a herring soup. The fish he'd been seeing every single day. At this point he would start throwing the fish through the room if it didn't have its weird eyes previously removed. Another thing about this place he wasn't going to miss after leaving. Dew saw 2 pairs of shoes, one medium and one small, pass him while heading for the door. He heard what sounded like a swear, but in a different language, but the tone in which the woman said them took any room for interpretation. "Don't speak to me or my daughter like that ever again, or you'll pay." Edith's raspy voice sounded from behind him, probably throwing something back with a similar message. He sighed, picked up the bucket, and went to empty it. The air was tepid, his head was throbbing from the ruckus, the sunlight stung in his eyes. What a good day for a walk, but a terrible day to work. The dirty water landed in a bush nearby, and then he went to a well somewhere too far away from the manor, hung the bucket on the hook and had it descend. On his way back he noticed a winged person leaving through the gate and vanishing behind a corner shortly after. The chef didn't stop fuming until she left the kitchen. Her every move was filled with anger. She had the knife go down on the herring's head as if it was that of her colleagues. The seasoning splattered into every direction. After everything was done for the others, Dew went to wipe off the mess of blood and pepper. The only creatures in the room were him and the cats, so it was quiet. Maybe this place wasn't a bad place to spend the night at, but he quickly rejected the idea. Who knew what those cats were up to in the dark? Waking up to the terrified screams of mice being torn to shreds would make his dreams much worse. He left the storage room unchecked and went straight upstairs. There was no noise coming from his room. Maybe his roommate had decided to stay somewhere else before going to sleep. The key clicked in the lock. The door didn't swing open. He pushed against the doorknob. It didn't move. Dew put more pressure onto it. Maybe the old iron was stuck and needed a little bit of a push. Still nothing. As he went full on in, he could hear laughter from the inside. "Open the door," Dew growled. What did the man take him for? What did he think of himself to just lock Dew out? The laughter only grew louder and more devious, and Dew kicked, but immediately felt the wood rather burst than to move in a piece. It would definitely land him a fine he wasn't willing to pay. Great, now he would have to sleep in the kitchen or in Avery's bed, but he swore revenge. Dew would be gone soon enough, so reputation wouldn't matter. He slammed his fist against the door one more time and went away. What a jerk. There was no way he could sleep right away. The gate could still be open. The guards knew him good enough to let him in even after staying out a while longer. It was dark already. A cold breeze made for a change in the overall warm temperature. It was just good enough to stay outside in nothing but a shirt. The cape was inside the room, so he had no other choice. Like so many times, he chose to walk along the shore, but in the direction opposite to where the chapel was located. There was no proper path to follow, only the small round pebbles who paved the area. Dew took off his boots, knotted the strings of them to his belt, and enjoyed the unique texture of the ground, which was still a little warm from the heat of the day. Slowly the night became too dark for him to see his environment clearly. There was no need to do so, though. It barely changed even after 50 meters, and navigating his way forth and back wouldn't be a problem. But the rising cold was. After 30 minutes of leisurely strolling to have his rage vanish with the waves, he saw something unusual in the distance. He squinted his eyes to check if he was hallucinating, but he wasn't. There was a tiny light dancing around, and it was coming closer. "I didn't expect to see you here," he greeted Avery. "Where have you been?" Her face appeared in the pink light of her flame. "What do you think? Walking, of course. But what are you doing here? Can't sleep?" Dew let himself fall into the ground and sighed loudly before answering. "Can't is surprisingly accurate. That bastard locked me out." She crossed her legs and placed her hand with the flame in her lap, one wing stretched out in the direction of the wind to shield and warm Dew. Avery leaned her head to the side, wondering, "Why is that? A conflict?" "Who knows?" He threw his hands in the air. "The whole day was a disaster of constant fighting and yelling, but I wasn't even involved. What is wrong with the people in this area?" "You could stay with me for the night. Sue will be occupied with certain things, so she won't complain, she offered, and he gave her a smile of gratitude. Then she went on, I do wonder, though, why did he lock you out? You're everything but a noisy person, and usually people automatically think well about you once they spend at least an hour with you. Maybe he's jealous because of that. Do you really think I get along well with people? Now Dew frowned, while his eyes searched hers in the little light of the flame. At least a little. It's not a skill everyone possesses, having your usual personality accepted well without having to change yourself too much. I think you could find many acquaintances just by being yourself, but you just don't want to chat around all the time because your field is quite busy. A stone face and grumpy small talk probably doesn't do well with most, he claimed, but grew annoyed when she responded with laughter. What is it now? He groaned while she wiped one pink eye with the tip of her finger. Oh, it's nothing, just that people hate when I'm acting like myself. Why's that? I like you most when you're yourself. Her smile grew wider. My dear Dew, are you serious? Almost every time I'm being myself you look incredibly disturbed, she chuckled. He was taken aback by the response. Was he really? Of course he wasn't all that talkative or expressive, but there was no way it could be interpreted like this. Am I so bad at showing joy around you? He said while looking for her eyes. She huffed. Only a little, but I'd say I can differentiate between happiness and worry. I noticed you like me best when I'm exactly like your typical wandering trader. Delighted, smiling, laughing a little, engaging in small talk and teasing just enough not to upset anyone. You don't want to see my crooked self, and I understand that. She was smiling at him, but there was something off about her. Her eyes were somewhere in the distance. Dew asked himself if she was serious or joking. Was she really putting on a mask every time they shared space? Was he really that blind? Then what is your authentic self according to you? Dew wanted to know, his dissatisfaction shining through his voice. Just look at a couple of days ago. My joke. That's how I cope with everything. Then maybe you should also know that I have had several moments of crisis within the last year that I only expressed somewhere else. Sue knows more about my free time than you do. I complain, I insult, I judge all of the time. When the time is right, I cut off people's fingers, and that's not even a joke. But don't worry too much about it. Everyone changes themselves at least a little bit to make the time with someone they like more comfortable, don't they? Avery outlined, her expression having frozen in place. The flame flickered, but not from the wind. Dew felt a splatter of water on his cheek from the sea and its restless surface, which then rolled down towards his lip, where he could taste the salt. Then he asked, Isn't that exhausting? Keeping everything to yourself, I mean. Dew saw her nodding slightly with her eyes closed. 4 darn years. He wasn't sure what else she was suppressing. Part of him didn't want to know. He had been happy in a relationship and had only considered the elements missing from achieving complete satisfaction was leaving Bota, leaving its laws and people behind forever. But now he heard only he had experienced it that way. He made up his mind, even though he shouldn't be the one having to decide on the matter, and suggested, Well, then just ignore me if I'm disturbed. I will have to accept it as it is. You're already putting up with my burdens. And you are sure you want to get yourself into this? Emotional swings, periods of going mute, harsh criticism. Are you sure you want to give up that comfort? Avery almost sounded threatening. How bad can it be? Dew thought to himself. There was a big chance she was just exaggerating or displaying her self-image, which he knew wasn't too bright. I want to, he told her. If you wish, she said in a sweet voice, but it followed an almost disappointed laughter. Just don't be disappointed if you suddenly lose feelings, because I will have you keep up that marriage contract for the sake of my own partial safety. Now, for an immediate revelation, maybe you're interested in a person I've been meeting daily since over a week in my free time. I'm sure you won't like each other all that much. He's competitive, a little feral and loud. I'd almost go as far as to say he's your polar opposite. Perhaps he would regret it at some point, but for now he wanted to know more. Jonah was a man slightly taller than him, probably because of the hooves connected to his hairy legs, which had 2 joints instead of 1. He was a 25-year-old Boer hybrid, but except his lower half, the only hint that he was different from a full human were the slightly pointy ears and perhaps the bodily hair. His skin was tanned from the sun, his torso broad, his icy blue eyes small, and the reddish-brown hair of shoulder length brushed to the back of his head. Avery had told him while walking that he was a traveller living in and from the forest. Dew had imagined a little hut somewhere in the thicket, but it turned out he really lived in the forest, and he looked like it. Jonah's only shelter was a tent barely the size of himself when lying down. In front of it was a little fireplace before which he sat. Even in the dim light, Dew could see his dirty clothes. There was 1 breastplate on his left side, which was held in place by a leather strap. Next to him lay the sheathed sword, a quiver filled with arrows, and a bow-like weapon. A crossbow, so Avery explained to him. She introduced Dew to him. "Jonah, this is Dew. I mentioned him before." "I thought he'd be missing a limb or 2, were the first words he spoke. "But all are intact, not even a finger gone. Face could look pretty, but Big words for someone covered in dirt, Dew desperately wanted to reply, but instead he politely said, "So, how did you meet?" He expected something along the lines of, "I found him while traveling through the forest, and we had a chat," but Jonah began to explain. "I used to watch over that rascal when his mother was busy caring for the other kids. We grew up together and fought a lot, and I even visited him when he and his brother were practically thrown out, but then I lost him for a while. Not gonna lie, I thought he was dead, but would you look at that?" Did Jonah not know that Avery wasn't a man? "If I were to describe the past 8 years, I would also call myself deceased," Avery commented. No wonder her fighting style mostly relied on force, if that used to be her opponent. It would take a grown man several swings to knock him unconscious. They had small talk. Jonah explained Avery had found him while he was strolling around, and that they had met regularly since then, mostly for catching up what the other had been up to, but to fight as well. Dew mostly listened. It turned out the Boer hybrid was a man who enjoyed talking, but Dew couldn't figure out what kind of opinion the other one had of him. There was something unsettling about him, maybe the way he described his illegal hunts for food, sword fights with Avery, or conflicts he got into because of his hybrid identity. He was practically drooling over the idea of getting into another one of those situations, a trait he had never actually seen this drastically before in a person. Or maybe it were those intense eyes which bore through Dew whenever they laid on him. Avery looked unfazed by any of it. Perhaps Jonah had been like this when they were still living together. The two only stayed with the strange man for a moment. Then they said their polite goodbyes and left him in his tent. Dew assumed it to be shortly before midnight, and he would have to do something the next day. On their way back, they took a proper way. The little flame couldn't spend enough light to reveal any inconvenient obstacles. "What do you think of him?" Avery asked. "I don't know him yet, but he's a little strange." "Yeah, that sounds correct. He said he'll follow us on our way back in 2 days. I will continue to meet him then, so you will have plenty of time to learn more about him," she revealed. "And about your roommate?" She turned towards him, and the fire reflecting in her eyes made it look as if they were glowing on their own. "If the same scenario happens after this night, just leave him to me." "What are you planning on doing?" he wanted to know, unable to guess. "That depends on my mood."